I recently co-authored with a colleague an oral history book about Australian lives in the 20th century. As you can see from the index on the screen there, we decided to index emotion. What I'm going to do in this talk with you this afternoon is briefly talk about the history of emotions and about how oral historians have handled emotion. I'm going to introduce you to this Australian Lives book and the Australian Generations Oral History Project that it came from, and the technologies that enable us to hear voice and listen to emotion. I'm going to show how we indexed emotion and some of the technologies around that, and then I'm going to think about what we might begin to learn when we both index but also explore and interpret emotion in oral histories. I'm going to share some examples of joy, and also I'll probably focus more on shame, because the stories of shame are very powerful and very intriguing and raise all sorts of interpretative issues. So let me start briefly with the history of emotions. As Guy said, the history of emotions has been one of the major turns in historical studies in the last, well, it's probably more than a decade now. There's a vast literature now on the history of emotions, which explores the significance of emotions in historical experience. It shows how emotions are central to everybody's embodied experience in everyday life. The literature also shows that emotions are not universal or timeless, but rather are historically and culturally situated. The literature shows us that emotions are individual to each of us, but they're also social. And so the literature talks about emotional regimes or emotional communities which manage and prescribe emotion, and which sometimes use emotion to manage behaviour. Excuse me. Now, in fact, oral historians have been doing a history of emotions for decades without calling it a history of emotions. Excuse me. In the 1970s, we talked about subjectivity, the subjective experience of people's lives that were revealed by the stories that they told. And famously, Sandro Portelli in the late 1970s explained that oral history and remembering was not just about events. It isn't just about what happened. It's also, and crucially, about the meanings and emotions of events. And indeed, that shows us how meanings and feelings profoundly impact what people do in our lives. So, in fact, oral historians have been doing emotional history for a lot longer than the last decade. We just haven't called it that. In my own oral history work, the emotional quality of experience and memory has been central to my work since the 1980s. And Guy talked about some of those projects. So interviewing First World War veterans like Fred Farrell, who you can see on this screen, highlighted the emotional experience of going to war, of going over the top in battle, of loss and grief, of separation from families, but also returning to families and dealing with dislocation, or in Fred Farrell's case, with shell shock and all the nervous suffering that he experienced in the years after the war, and that he was still feeling in our interviews in the early 1980s. Or interviewing migrants like Joan Pickett, who you can see on that screen there, highlights aspects of the emotional experience of migration, the excitement about imagining that you'll move to live in another part of the world, the anxiety and the concerns and the real sadness of leaving family and friends, the confusion of arriving in a new country, the struggle with language, with being misunderstood. And of course, migration never ends, and the experiences of migration right up until the point of interview are still profoundly emotional, as people are still dealing with the feelings of their emotion and managing and negotiating them. Oral historians have long been alert to two interconnected aspects, or if you like, temporalities of emotion in oral history. Emotion at the time of the event and emotion at the time of the telling. In other words, whenever we interview someone, there's evidence there about the emotions that they felt in the distant past that they're remembering, whether it was going to war or arriving in Australia as a migrant. But we've also got emotion at the time of the telling as they're remembering and sharing with you their memories of that past. So the emotions are both from the time of the event and the time of the telling. And it's really tricky sometimes to disentangle those two emotions that are overlapping and interconnected. And oral historians have been particularly alert to the emotional qualities and issues of the oral history relationship at the time of the telling. That's one of the things in recent years we've got really good at listening for and thinking about. How does the relationship shape the remembering, but also what's the emotionality in the room as we're recording people's lives? More recently, I think oral historians have also been alert to a third time of emotion in oral history, and that is emotion at the time of listening and interpretation. We might be listening to interviews that we conducted ourselves, or we might be sitting in an archive or online listening to interviews done many years ago, and we actually experience emotion as we listen. And we can use, some of the literature has been showing us how we can use our own emotionality as we listen to those interviews as clues about feelings, as they don't tell us what we should be thinking or feeling about the interview, but they remind us that something's going on that's moving us in particular ways, and therefore we need to listen really closely to the interview to work out why. What is the emotional content of that recording? And as we listen, oral historians are alert to the fact that much of the emotional meaning in interviews is in the voice, as well as the words, as well as the face and body if you're doing a video interview. And thus we need to listen really carefully, or to watch really carefully, for emotions. And yet, there's a real serious challenge in locating and interpreting emotion in interviews. Whether they're audio or video interviews, you have to actually listen to them or watch them in real time. And that takes a lot of time. Whether you're talking 1 5-hour interview or 50 interviews, it's a lot of time to go through, listen and watch, to look at it, listen, to find emotions. And so we often, therefore, we go to transcripts, which capture some of the emotion, but not all of it. So it's a real challenge, locating and interpreting emotion in interviews. But digital technologies in recent years have begun to make it easier for us to locate and interpret emotion in oral history interviews. And I want to give you examples from one Australian project that Guy mentioned in the introduction, the Australian Generations Project. This is a project that I led in the early 2010s in Australia. It was well funded by the Australian Research Council. It was a collaboration between 2 universities, the National Library of Australia and ABC Radio National, the national broadcaster. There was a large research team, and we employed 25 interviewers all over Australia, which is a big country, and conducted 300 life history interviews, averaging 4 or 5 hours each, typically recorded in 2 separate sessions all over the country. You'll all know that oral history is never a representative sample. It's a sample of the willing, but we did try to seek demographic diversity amongst our interviews. So among the 300 interviews, we interviewed 50 people born in each decade from the 1920s through to 1989. And we sought to interview people in all the different regions and states of Australia, men and women. We sought to interview the whole racial and ethnic complexity and variety of Australia, with a quarter of the interviewees born overseas and a significant number of Aboriginal interviewees. And we tried to get the range of Australian social class. So it's a pretty diverse sample that captures Australian lives across the 20th century and into the 21st century. So as I said, we created 300 interviews, 1,221 hours of digital audio. It was an audio rather than a video project because we did it with the Australian National Radio Broadcaster and made a whole series of radio programs with the material. And the National Library, it collects both audio and video, but particularly favours audio interviews. Those interviews are all accessible to researchers, subject to the rights agreements signed by each interviewee. Indeed, some of them are closed for a specified time period. Some of them are only accessible by researchers who come to the National Library, which is in Canberra, the national capital. But about 2/3 of the interviews that we conducted are now fully accessible online through the National Library of Australia catalogue, as you can see on the slide. And literally, you just click on that button, which says Listen Online, and it takes you straight to the interview in the online archive, and it begins to play it. It's just lovely to be able to access and listen to the interviews that we've recorded. Let me just briefly introduce you to some of the magic that the National Library developed as part of our project which has enabled us to access and use these interviews in really interesting ways. This is what the page looks like when you click on that listen button, and it opens up an interview, and a lot of the interviews are transcribed, and it brings up the transcript. And the most significant thing is the transcript is in short chunks, and each of those chunks has a little arrow next to it. And if you click on that arrow, you're online, you've opened up the interview. As soon as you click on that arrow, it plays that extract. So the text and the audio are synced so that you can move between them. There's a lovely facility where you can search for any word within the transcript, and it takes you to it, and then you can listen to that bit. And you can also search using words across the whole collection. So you could, for example, search for the term adoption and find adoption in one interview, but across the 200 interviews that are available online, and then listen to all the different extracts about that topic. And then for each of these extracts that you can see, there's also a citation, which is basically a URL. And it's a separate URL for every extract, which if you're making a publication, a book or a journal article, you can put that hyperlink in the references or in the main text. And then if someone's reading it as an ebook and they click on the link, it plays the extract. And what it does, it doesn't just separate out an MP3 of that little extract. Literally, that link takes you back into the National Library archive and takes you back to that part of the interview and plays it. And it plays the extract, but actually it keeps on playing. So you actually just listen to the rest of that interview. This technology was developed by our colleagues at the National Library as we were doing interviews, and it really is magical, and we love it. Can I just ask if Rona and Aviva, if you could just mute your videos? It's just there's a limit on my screen and it makes it easier for me to see my slides as I'm going. Thanks. So let me now return to our book about Australian lives, which I co-authored with my colleague Anisa Puri, who just today got her PhD, which I'm really excited about. But we wrote this book together. And this book uses interviews from the Australian Generations Project. And I want to explore how we use this magical technology in this book and how we use it to index and interpret emotion. Let me briefly explain the book. We chose 50 of the 300 interviews, all of them interviews that were fully transcribed. And this is the contents page of the book. And you can see there's two types of chapters in the book. There are chapters arranged by life stage, starting with ancestry, childhood, youth, midlife, and later life. And then there are chapters which are more thematic, for example, about faith, about migration, about activism, and about telling my story. And in some of the chapters, there are also subsections as well. And in each section, so for example, if you looked at teenage family life, there are extracts from those 50 interviews, starting with the interviews that are talking about the 1920s and 30s, moving up to the interviews that are talking about the 2010s, and tracing the changing experience of that topic in Australian lives across time. There are also short historiographical or historical introductions for each of the sections to set the scene. And there is a section of further listening and reading at the end of every section, so you can access other interviews in the collection that aren't in the book. And once we'd selected, we went through the 50 interviews that we'd chosen, and we selected extracts and we arranged them into this structure. We also, and I won't talk about this in detail now, but you might like to ask me about it in the questions session, but we edited those extracts because we know that if we read a transcript of an interview, it's not a verbatim transcript. It's not always easy to read. And we knew that people would be reading the text of the book, so we lightly edited the text to make it easier. But we weren't too worried about that because we knew that people would also be able to listen if they wanted and hear the voice and the words exactly as they were spoken. So here's an example, or let me say there are different ways you can experience this book. You can read it as a paperback. You can just buy it as a paperback and read it lying in bed. But we also made it as an ebook where you can read and listen at the same time. On this page, you can see on the left, that's a page from the ebook. It's an extract from an interview with Doug Fong, who came from a place called Broome up in the north of Australia, talking about his childhood when he was evacuated from Broome when the Japanese were threatening to invade in the 1940s. And if you click on Doug's name at the top of that extract, it immediately takes you and opens up in your browser. So you've got this open in your browser. It then opens up another page in your browser, which is this page here, which is actually in the National Library Online Archive. It takes you directly to that extract from the book, and it starts to play it. As soon as you click it, it opens and it plays, and you listen to it, and you listen to Doug telling this story that's in the book. And actually, if you want, it just keeps on playing, and you can keep on listening, or you can stop it and go back to the book. So what happens as you're reading, you're listening, and you're hearing the qualities and meanings of sound and the emotionality of voice. It's a very rich, it's like reading a book in stereo. It's a very rich reading and listening experience. The Australian Lives book that came out of the Australian Generation interviews, well, the Australian Generation interviews, they're just crowded with emotions. You can see from that quote from Rhonda King, who was interviewed for the book, and she was born in 1965. She says, life is long. When you're 48, there's been a lot of stuff that's happened. And she laughs. It's got elements of comedy, and there are elements of heartache and drama and thriller, and it's got so many things in it. So this is a book that's full of laughter and heartache and drama and thrills. And that's one of the reasons why oral history, why people's stories are so engaging, because the emotions really engage you. And so when Anissa and I were preparing this book, which we knew was going to be an ebook as well as a paperback, and when we were preparing an index for the book, we thought, well, why don't we index emotion so that people could actually look at and follow different emotions, not just topics like adoption or war or work or whatever, but actually we decided we would index emotion in the book. And this is the index from the book. As you can see, we indexed a whole range of different emotions, from anger alphabetically all the way through to trauma. And you can see in every one of those page numbers in blue next to each of the index items is a different page in the book. And if you just click on that number in the index, it takes you directly to that page in the book, and you click on the extract and you can listen to it. So you can listen to all of those different extracts about laughter, for example, and listen to all the different ways that people laugh and what that might mean. Now, I have to say, indexing emotion was a pretty painstaking process. It involved a lot of reading and listening to the extracts and trying to work out what emotions were going on. It was a little bit rough and a little bit approximate. Sometimes it was easy because people were explicit and they used the words like hate or love or guilt or shame, and that was easy. Sometimes we had to read the emotions for more implicit statements or words or sounds in the interviews and make judgments about what type of emotion. So it wasn't perfect. And there were definitional issues. For example, if you look at love in the index, you'll see that we ended up indexing two different types of love of activities, places and things, which were very strongly expressed, but also love of people and, in fact, love of pets, because we felt like they were very similar. And laughter. If you look at laughter, anyone who's done oral history interviews knows that there are so many different types of laughter. There's humorous bellyache laughters, there's sarcastic laughter, there's sad laughter, there's awkward laughter. Laughter can mean many, many different things. It was too difficult for us to distinguish every time we heard laughter in an interview, but we indexed all of the laughter in the book. And there's a lovely project out there for someone just to listen to all of those laughs and try and explore, well, what does laughter mean in oral history interviews, and how do people use laughter when they tell their stories? But we felt that the index was a guide. It was provided an opportunity to research emotion and to allow readers and listeners to click and listen and to compare, consider, and maybe seek to explain different types of emotional articulations in oral history interviews. Let me start briefly, and I'll talk a little bit about happiness and joy, which is one of the index items. You can see there that happiness and joy had 22 index items in the book, and that it was between the emotion of guilt, which had 5 items, and the emotion of hate, which had 8 items. And this is just in the book, not in the whole interview collection. There are many different types of joy and happiness experienced for different reasons across the life course. Let me introduce you to Ruth Axe, who was interviewed for the project in 2012 in Sydney. Ruth was born in 1926 in Wagga Wagga, which is a small country town in New South Wales, and then went eventually to live in Sydney. And I'm just going to put up on screen I think there were 4 moments in the extracts that we used in the book from her interview where she really expressed happiness and joy. And it gives you a sense of the range and variety. So there's the first story is about in the 1930s as a young girl. They lived in the country and they used to drive with her family 200 miles to the beach, the east coast of Australia. We would go to the beach, and she says it wasn't known in those days, but my mother would cover us in coconut oil, which meant we promptly fried and we would come out in blisters, but we would happily swim there in the surf. And my father was a good swimmer and he would take us out, and it was all very enjoyable. My parents must have had to make sacrifices to do that for us, but it was such a happy time. The second extract's very, very different. This is when she was a young mother. She'd had 2 children, and then after the third one was born, I said, I didn't want any more. And that happily coincided with the introduction of the pill. I think I rejoiced. It was the contraceptive pill, which came to Australia in the mid-1960s. She didn't want any more children. She really wanted a working life. So for her, and she remembers rejoicing at the possibility that she could limit her family size. The third quote, one reason she wanted to go on the pill and she didn't want any more children was she loved work, and she ended up having a very successful professional life. And she describes in this third extract, she just started a part-time job, and then they rang me up after Christmas and they said, that position that you were doing casually is available. Would you like it? I said, yes, please. And I went back to work. I'm now glad I did. I thoroughly enjoyed it. It made a lot of financial difference to the house. I started in a stenographer's pool, a typist, and then I became the secretary to the engineer, and then I worked for the mayor. And indeed, she had a very successful career. And unlike many women of her generation, she tells her professional story with just as much pride as she tells the story of family life. The fourth extract is towards the end of the interview when she's reflecting on old age, and she's reflecting on her friends, many of whom and some of whom have dementia and are losing their memories. And she reflects on her remembering, and says memory is terribly important. If you can't remember what you did as a child, you've lost that joy or sorrow, whatever it happens to be. It's a wonderful moment in the interview when she's been remembering both joy and sorrow in her interview, and as an old woman, she's now thinking back to those times. It's recapturing or recreating a particular type of joy or sorrow, but she knows that remembering those emotions is still really important to her as a woman in old age. And if you look across each of those examples, you can get a sense of what made Ruth happy at different points in her life. Quality time spent with parents and siblings on the beach, a fulfilling career, reminiscing about a life well lived. We also get a sense of how happiness was impacted by social relations and historical circumstances. So in the 1930s, Ruth's family was comparatively affluent, so they could afford a car and a family holiday, which was not typical in Australia. And Ruth's father could afford to spend time with his children, and that time was fondly remembered. And then later, in the 1960s, the contraceptive pill made a career an option for a talented and ambitious young woman who was a frustrated housewife and mother. So you get a sense of the diversity, the real extraordinary diversity of different experiences of happiness and joy. I could say more about happiness and joy, but I'm going to turn now to shame. Shame was indexed in Australian Lives in the book just 10 times. You can see it there alongside safe, shock, shyness, sadness. Shame overlaps with disapproval and humiliation and guilt, which are also indexed. So probably there's more shame in the book than we've indexed in those 10 items. If you read the history of emotions, shame is one of the emotions these historians write a lot about. It's a very powerful emotion. It's a very powerful emotion in oral history. Indeed, there's quite a lot of oral history, for example, written about the Depression of the 1930s and the shame experienced by unemployed men who were unable to keep their families as they were accustomed to do. The shame at the time, but also often the shame in remembering being unemployed. So shame is a very powerful emotion. I think we probably might have indexed it more than we did. It's hard to judge. Shame was mostly explicit. People often use the term shame or ashamed in their interviews, though not always. And they tended to use it when they felt they may have been a bad person in some way. Or perhaps they still feel bad about it. They still feel ashamed when they tell the story about a particular experience. But also, shame often, as you'll hear, often involved a process of shaming. Often something was shameful because of social norms that certain types of behaviour were shameful. And what's clear in the interviews, that social attitudes and personal experiences might change, such that by the time of telling, a person may have a critical stance on that shame. They may have been ashamed and made to feel shame perhaps in the 1950s, but when they're telling you their story in the 2010s, they no longer feel shame, they feel anger that they were treated so badly. They have a different perspective. So you're getting the shame of the time of the telling and a different set of feelings at the time of the event. Clicking through the items that were indexed for shame, we saw there's a whole range of different sorts of historical contexts where people experienced shame for what they did or for who they were, often due to particular social norms and shaming within families or within the wider society. Although often cases in these extracts, the interviewees look back now critical of how they were regarded, how they were treated, how they were shamed in the past. And they sometimes look back with anger or bitterness and with thoughtful reflections about it. So if you look at the slide, you can see some of the examples from the interviews of the sort of circumstances. So the first one is about unmarried mothers. And this is David Cooper remembering a relative in the early 20th century who was an unmarried mother and left the small state of Tasmania so that no one knew that she was pregnant and went to Melbourne to have a baby. And as he says, she did that because you wouldn't disgrace the family's name because you were pregnant. So a really powerful experience of shaming in early 20th century Australia for a single unmarried mother. The second example comes from the 1970s, and this is Trish Barkman recalling. She was born in 1933. She's recalling the early 1970s in the city of Brisbane. She'd recently been divorced and she had 2 small children, and she had to go out to work, which was unusual for women of her class and background at that time. And she was described as her children were described as latchkey children. I don't know if that translates in Hebrew, but as she says, that was an expression that was used to talk about children who came home from school to an empty house because their mother was at work. And as Trish says about being described as latchkey children, there was that stigma. There was that moral undertone that you were leaving your children. And as she says, what else were we supposed to do? How else were we supposed? And you can see she's pretty angry when she remembers how she was shamed in the 1970s. The third example, which I won't go into in detail, this is an interview with a much younger woman, Milijana Stojadinovic, who was a Serbian-Australian woman born in Australia but with Serbian family. And she's remembering being a school child in Australia during the Balkan Wars in the 1990s. There are a lot of Croatians, a lot of Serbians and Bosnians in Melbourne. And she remembers members of the Croatian community being very critical of Serbian atrocities in the war. And as she says, I felt very ashamed of being Serbian because of everything that was said to me about those people and about that time. But I shouldn't have been made to feel that way. Again, you get the shame as she's remembering it at the time of the event and how she's now thinking about that shame at the time of the telling. And there are many other circumstances in the interview that involve people remembering shame, for example, about mental ill health or sexuality or unemployment or indeed addiction, which is the next slide. And the next slide that I want to play, I'm going to hopefully play an extract from the interview that you'll be able to hear, because I want you to be able to hear the emotion in the voices of a story. This is a story from a school teacher, Lynn Sanders Braithwaite. She was born in 1949, but she became a drug user, heroin user, and a heavy drinker for most of the 1970s up until 1987, at which point she left her husband and, for a time, her children on the north coast of New South Wales to go to Sydney to get clean, to get off the drugs. It's a very, very powerful story that she tells. And I'll just show you the first extract. She says, I had these two beautiful children that I adored, but it was caravan parks and farmhouses and evictions, lots of violence within the home, lots of fear, a constant feeling of failing at everything that I'd ever believed in or wanted. And then she goes on, and the next extract really gives you a sense of the shame that she felt at the time that compelled her to make the decision to leave her family. She says, 1987, just before I left my marriage and took off to Sydney to get clean and sober, we had to go to Coffs Hospital, a hospital nearby. The kids, they had ear surgery coming up. This is the children. And something went wrong with the equipment. One of the doctors said, even children of women like this deserve better treatment. I realised then that it was beginning to impact on them. I knew if they were to stay in the world that I was offering them, they would become children of the local drunk or the local junkie. I hated that. I've never forgotten that day. That burnt into my memory. But that was one of the days I can. I was gone within 2 days of that. You can get a sense of the profound shame she felt back in 1987. You can get a sense of the difficulty of remembering that moment many years later. It's still difficult. You get a sense of her efforts to make sense of the experience in ways that she now feels okay, but you also get a sense that that composure is tenuous and difficult. And hopefully you can hear a bit of that in the next slide. So this is an extract from the book, and I'm going to play it in a moment. The first paragraph you can see there is the extract that we used in the book. I'm going to play the link, which actually takes the audio to the archive, and it plays. And actually it keeps on playing beyond the extract in the book, which is akin to the experience if you're reading to the ebook and you click on one of the links. And she tells this whole story. So touch wood, I'm just going to check that the audio settings are still set. Yep. Hopefully you'll be able to hear this, but if you can't, you'll be able to read it as she's speaking and listen to her voice. And I should just say, you can hear all sorts of bird song. This was recorded in outback Australia, and you can hear the parrots and the currawongs and all the other Australian birds, which sometimes makes it a little difficult to hear her voice, but it's another lovely aspect of oral history where you can hear the place where she's remembering this story. But it's a very powerful story, which I'll play for you now.
Knew nothing about life without drugs by then. It certainly knew nothing about life without alcohol, because all the family had drunk. Well, not mum. Everyone except mum. But that was the beginning of life turning a corner completely. I still think in later years I was still ashamed of leaving the children, and an old lady in Maroubra said to me that she'd left her son and it was the single most honourable thing she'd ever done. And that was a real gift, because I knew where I'd left them, they were going to be safe and they were going to be loved. There wouldn't be in danger anymore, and they'd be fed and clothed and all those sort of things, which they were, of course. Yeah, that was the end of the marriage, and we tried hard. I look back sometimes, I feel it wasn't that. We tried, we fought and struggled trying to beat it, and you can't beat it, not that way. You just, you put up a good fight, and it won. And I left, on the train.
It's such a powerful extract. You can hear the rawness of her voice. You can hear her voice that's been damaged by years of drug taking, but also you can get a sense not only of the shame she felt at the time, but also how she's trying to still come to terms and explain what she did and the importance of that woman who told her that it was okay, she was doing the right thing. And she says that was a real gift. But for me, it's just one of many examples that listening to the interview gives you a whole extra layer to make sense of the emotions in this experience, both at the time in 1987, but also at the time of the interview, 25 years later. Let me finally move on and conclude with some extracts from an interview with Arthur Hunter, which illuminate the complex ways in which the notion of shame was part of his life and story as a young Aboriginal man living in Northern Australia, and also how shame carries distinctive cultural meanings in his Aboriginal world in remote northwestern Australia, in an area called the Kimberley, which is where he grew up. You can see there a picture of Arthur. Arthur grew up, his parents had separated when he was a young child, and his father lived on the coast, the west coast, in a cattle town, basically, which had big wharves and so on. His father lived and worked there, his Aboriginal father. His Aboriginal mother, by contrast, lived several hundred miles inland on country, on the original country of their Aboriginal community and language group, on a cattle station that Aboriginal community had taken over. And Arthur grew up as a young child with his mother and his grandparents on this cattle station, learning the Aboriginal language of his tribe, learning culture, learning about sacred spots, learning about hunting and so on and so forth. But he had two families and two places, and he would move between his mother's world on country, Aboriginal country, and his father's world in the Australian town. He moved between these two places, these two worlds that he was, if you like, split between. He loved being homeschooled by his mother and his relatives on Aboriginal country, but he also went and spent time with his father. I'm just going to show you this extract where he remembers that moving between the two. So he talks about it was really fun being with his mother and his family on country in an Aboriginal culture. And then we went into town and went to school there. And I was really, really quiet boy, really shy. I didn't really get along with people. I'm not a people's person. But maybe when I want to be, I can be. Back in the days where you couldn't get a good conversation out of me like what I'm doing now with you. So it was really, for me back then, it was really, I think it was shame. And I don't know what the meaning shame is. I think it's just being ignorant, I reckon. I reckon when I was back then, I was being ignorant. 2005, I wanted to quit school and go work in the station with my family or, you know, do something because I thought I was dumb and I couldn't learn much. My teacher telling me, Arthur, stick into it. Next year will be a good year for you. You know, you'll really love it. But for me, I was really shy. I couldn't really talk. And when he's telling me about this place called Galari that we're in now, Galari Media in Broome, Galari Media Enterprises, back in 2006, he said, we're going to go to Broome, which is a country town, do school-based training. We're going to go into radio. I was like, what? Radio? That's going to be shame. Now, it's not an uncommon experience for all sorts of young Australians to feel dumb or to be made to feel dumb or shamed in school. There's plenty of that in interviews with white Australians as well as Aboriginal Australians. So that's a common experience. But for Arthur, there's a whole other layer in his shame, the contrast between his comfort in an Aboriginal family and schooling and his discomfort in the town school, which probably contributed to his sense of shyness, his awkwardness, to his not wanting to talk in a school context, such that he wanted to drop out of school. And then when he's encouraged by a teacher to continue and indeed to go to the local town of Broome, another town, to do homeschooling, to learn, if you like, on the job with an Aboriginal radio station called Galari Media, he's still worried about shame. That's going to be shame. Doing something new, being with people I don't know, being shy, being exposed. But for Arthur, shame also has a distinctive Aboriginal quality. Anthropologists have shown that shame is one of the strongest emotions with Indigenous communities across Australia. and that the operation and meanings of shame can vary across different Aboriginal communities. After more than a century of colonisation and adaptation, shame is centred on knowing, but even more so on not knowing the Indigenous law. And in many remote Aboriginal communities, like where Arthur grew up, shame is critical for intergenerational knowledge transmission to young men and women. Shame is used by elders in many Aboriginal communities to teach children how to behave appropriately and to monitor and control appropriate behaviour. It's central to the forging of well-socialised and responsible community members. So, in Aboriginal communities, it can be culturally inappropriate and shameful to speak directly about difficult matters. Being singled out from the mob, from the Aboriginal mob, can be a cause for shame, as it was for Arthur, as a black country kid in the town school, or when he anticipated becoming the new worker at a media company in Broome. The potential for shame generates a range of emotions and behaviours such as shyness, embarrassment, or modesty. So in Aboriginal Australia, shame is central to the organisation of feelings by which kinship and community relations are maintained. So in Arthur's interview, shame is used in relation to several different but related situations and behaviour. He uses shame in terms of talking directly about difficult things. That's shameful. He uses shame in the context of a fear of being rejected or of behaving inappropriately, of cultural shame. And I'm going to just show you an extract where when we were indexing this, I wouldn't have known that this was an extract about shame, except that the interviewer knew and understood local Aboriginal culture and drew it out in the interview. So he's basically talking about dating culture amongst young Aboriginal men and women in the Kimberley in the northwest of Australia in the early 2000s. And he talks about this competition called Kimberley Girl in 2006. And me and my mate and my teacher, they're creating the staging for this event to help the mob set up. And there was one girl in the competition, her name was Anjay Phillips. She was checking me out from what she's telling me. Then on the finals night, she got someone to come up and ask me, if you want to go out or hook up or something. I was a good boy. The girl come up to me and said, this girl want to know. I'm thinking, fuck. I was thinking, gee. Then I asked this other dude here, my cousin, but I was shocked that the girl wanted to go out with me or something. Go out with me? I was speechless. I was shaking. And then Elaine Rabbit, the interviewer, she asked this question, can you explain that that's a bit of Broome style or Kimberley style, Aboriginal style, about how Anjay didn't come up to you direct? And Arthur continues, up here in the Kimberley, we don't. Well, some people do, but most people don't. They get they get a friend or a cousin to ask a girl or a guy out. So they don't go directly to the person and ask them because they're scared to get shut down or get rejected. And people don't like that, getting rejected. So she did that to me and she got someone else to do it for her. And I said, yeah, okay, might as well. I was really shy and a little good boy. I love the extract. Arthur's aware, interestingly, that actually telling his life story in the interview might itself have been difficult, even shameful, as he discusses in the conclusion. Partly because of his identity and awkwardness as a shy young man, he's worried about telling his story in an oral history interview, but he's also worried because it might not be deemed culturally appropriate for a young Aboriginal man to talk about himself or his family or his culture in this context. But in the course of the interview, Arthur realised not only that he has developed confidence in himself and his words through the last 10 years of his working life, through his education and his work, but also he now feels an imperative to talk about his history and his Aboriginal culture. And you can hear this in the final extract from the ebook, which is the final part of the interview with Arthur, where he talks about telling his story and why he did the interview. And this is another extract I'm going to play. And this is the extract in the book that you can read there. But just be warned that the interview, if you're reading this in the book and you click on the link and listen to it, the interview carries on beyond the piece you can read, and it actually goes up to the end, just another 30 seconds or so to the end of the interview. And it's just a lovely exchange. But let me play this, and I hope you can hear it.
I reckon this interview, I've been waiting for this interview, but I don't think it would be now or in this form. But I'm really glad I'm doing this to get my word out there and save me saying it all the time to my mate, and talking about my culture and my history. I'm talking about it as actually a step forward for me, so I can maybe do something later on. So it's been pretty good. I don't find no shame in doing it. I feel happy because I'm doing it, because I'm getting my story out there for people to actually listen to or look at or listen to.
Is there anything else you'd like to say?
Don't be ashamed. Be game. Have self-confidence.
Thank you very much, Arthur. Shall we leave it at that?
Yeah, we should. Thank you for your time, and to the National Museum of Australia,
National Library, and
National Library, and who?
Monash University.
Monash. Aye.
It's in Melbourne.
Thanks for you guys to actually give me the opportunity.
And that's where it finishes. Listening to the complex layers and meanings of shame in Arthur Hunter's account has shown me how emotion is both cultural and historical, shaped by distinctive cultural expectations and historical circumstances. Along with other interviews from our Australian Generations project, it shows how emotional registers can change across time, within a person's life, and within the wider community. These interviews confirm that oral history offers rich potential to record and interpret the diverse emotional qualities of historical experience. And yet, to conclude, oral historians of emotion need to be alert to a number of methodological and epistemological challenges. We need to consider how emotions at the time of the event are always entangled with the narrator's emotions at the time of the telling, and the interviewer's or future listeners' emotions at the time of listening. As researchers, we need to disentangle those emotional threads and thus distinguish the feelings and meanings of emotional experiences at different points of time. When we record an interview, we need to consider how our own emotions intersect with and impact upon the narrator's emotions and their storytelling. When we listen to interviews, we need to be aware of our own historically and culturally specific emotional registers so that we can listen hard and carefully for the feeling and meanings of emotions from other temporally or culturally foreign contexts. We need to accept that the labels we draw from our own cultural context to index and identify emotion might not work for other contexts and other times, and that they are at best a guide for listening and interpretation. And of course, we need to use text as no more than a starting point for interpretation, and to listen and watch for the oral and visual clues of embodied emotion. Thank you very much, and I'll stop there and stop sharing and look forward to seeing you all back on the screen.
Thank you very much. I'll encourage people to switch on their cameras. Already I can see some hands going up, and there's also a question in the chat from Shmuel Yerushalmi, which I'll call on once shortly. I just wanted to thank you for what was a very, very impressive talk for me, a very eye-opening talk in terms of the verification and the categorization of a rich kind of set of how we approach these issues. I like very much your conclusion about how the challenge we have to disentangle emotions, which are culturally and socially and historically specific at every moment. And I think that's a huge challenge. And also how you added this layer, which is not just about the interviewee, which we always focus on. Now we know we need to bring in the interviewer, but you've added another layer, and that's the listener. And I think, at least for myself, I know that the first thing I've already noted is to buy the ebook, not just the textbook, because I think it's a whole different medium that you're offering us to actually listen to it and read it at the same time, which is fantastic. So thank you very much for that. I'm going to call on people. The first question was a very specific question, so I'll read it to you. It came in the text, and it's before we maybe get to the larger questions. And if other people want to add in text, they can add, or they can just put up a hand. I can see Margalit put up a hand. I'll call on her soon. The question is from Shmuel Yerushalmi, who wanted to know about changes of attitudes to unmarried women. If you could say a few words about that, if it changed since the earlier periods. He says 18th, 19th, that's not exactly what you're dealing with. You're dealing mainly with early 20th. And at the moment, if today there's still stigmas related to unmarried women.
It's a really significant topic that a lot of researchers, women's historians and feminist historians have covered. And indeed, there is a significant shift. The stigma that was very strong in the 19th and particularly in the early 20th century, that continues really. And indeed, children are being removed, or unmarried mothers are encouraged to give their children up for adoption. And they go and stay in babies' homes, and then the children, and that's happening right through up until the 1970s. And a number of things happened in the 1970s in Australia: the second wave feminism, the contraceptive pill, and basically and also critically, a Labor government introduces a single mother's payment. So basically, single mothers can afford to raise their children by themselves, which they couldn't before. And gradually, over the last couple of decades of the 20th century, that stigma goes. And there are a lot of single parents out there now. It's still difficult, but it's not stigmatized in the way that it was for most of the 20th century. So yeah, it's changed. And most people who remember, like David Cooper remembering his grandmother and his aunt, they look back at it now in horror, that they had to leave the island, the small island of Tasmania, which was a very small community where a lot of people knew each other. If you were a pregnant single mother, you had to go to the mainland to have the baby so that nobody knew. And they're appalled to discover that was what used to happen.
Well, I think that's remarkable, not only in terms of how the situation changed, or the question was about what reality changed in Australia, but also how our attitudes changed, so our emotions to these historical phenomena change over time. And that's, I think, comes out remarkably in your answer and in the talk. Margalit, you had a question, please.
Thank you. First of all, thank you very much for a fascinating lecture. I have two small questions. One, did you get any feedback from interviewees to the way you interpreted their emotions? And the second is, do you see any difference between audio and video in the way interviewees express their emotions?
Yeah, thanks very much. On the first question, actually in the book, Australian Lives, we don't interpret the emotions. The book is mostly, it's interview extracts arranged next to each other. We don't actually stand back as authors and interpret the extracts. We allow the readers we arrange them and juxtapose them and show change across time. But although we index an emotion like sadness or happiness, we don't try and describe in the book what it's about. So I know we did get a lot of feedback when we launched the book from people who were interviewed or in the book, and they loved listening to their stories and so on. But we weren't interpreting them in that case. I'm writing another book now, and my colleague Anissa Puri has just finished her PhD using the interviews, and she's done a book about youth migration to Australia using the interviews. And she's now considering publication, and she's having to think about how she's used the extracts and interpreted people's lives, and whether she will de-identify the extracts, or whether, given that the interview is if the interview is available in the archive anyway, whether she should allow people to listen to the interview and make up their own opinion, or whether in some cases she might go back to the interviewee and say, "Are you happy for me to publish that?" But in the Australian Lives book, we weren't interpreting the emotions in the way that I have now. Although I have a version of this I wrote and shared with Arthur and sent to him in the Kimberley. And Trish Barkman, who I quoted, and Lynn Sanders have also heard me talk about this. And on the whole, I mean, one of the things about oral history, you're very careful when you interpret people's lives if you know they're going to listen to your interpretation or read it. And so you're really careful with it. And you certainly don't judge people, and you try and understand their situation and how they dealt with it and remembered it. But yeah, any of us who've done oral history and used oral histories, we know that that's tricky. In terms of your second question, Margaret, about audio and video, for this project, we just did audio interviews, partly because we were making radio. We took photographs in every interview of the person, but also the person holding an object or standing in a place of significance, so we could capture something of that. We didn't do video interviews, and I know because I've worked with video interviews. I'm on the advisory committee of the Jewish Holocaust Centre in Melbourne, and we're currently reflecting on that, and they're mostly video interviews. And as you would know better than me, the face and the body as people are telling those stories is incredibly powerful and contains all sorts of clues. That's great. I would just say that making a good video interview is much harder and more expensive than making a good audio interview. It usually requires somebody doing the videoing while you're asking the questions. Often projects do audio interviews and then maybe do follow-up video. But you're absolutely right. There's a whole layer of emotional meaning that you can get when you can see a person as well as hear them. But I have to say, even when you're not in the room, I had a student once who wrote a piece about what you miss when you've got the video interview. Yes, you can hear it and you can see it, but you weren't in the room and you weren't feeling the vibes in the room. So it's still not exactly the same as being in the room. It's still it's one step removed. But there's no doubt, if you've got a video interview, you will see things that are important that you won't see in the transcript, and you might not pick up in the voice. Thank you. It's a really good question.
I can see Dalia Offer putting up her hand, and Dalia has a lot of experience of working specifically with Holocaust interviews in video and in audio. Dalia, please.
Thank you. Well, first of all, thank you really for a fascinating and rich and really interesting, very interesting lecture. I really appreciate it very much. You mentioned, and I really many times tackled with this issue of my feelings while I'm listening to the interviewing. And this is, I think, like anthropologists are saying that you have to understand that you are there with all your worldview and understanding and so on when you are interpreting what you are talking with the interviewer. Can you say something about your own experience about it, and in a way, how did it impact your writing when you are describing, either in this book or in other occasions or in an article, the interviews?
It's such a good question. I mean, any of us who've done oral history, it's an extraordinary event. It's not an ordinary conversation. People are opening up about their lives in a way that they don't normally do. Becomes very intimate and often very trusting and often very emotional. And as you say, as you're listening to someone, you're feeling things as well. You're feeling possibly a connection to their grief when they're talking about the loss of a child, because perhaps you've lost a child, or you're feeling about the story about their grandfather who suffered after the war, and you're feeling that in your own way because you had a grandfather who suffered in the war. I think I'm a very different interviewer than I was when I did my first interviews with war veterans in 1983 when I was 23. And it's an interesting point. With the Australian Generations Project, we had 25 different people doing these interviews. They were all pretty skillful interviewers, but they were different ages. And we had a number of younger people in their early 20s, and then we had everyone up through to people in their 70s doing the interviews. And life history interviews can be very emotional. You never know what's going to come up, and you might have the death of a child or serious illness or whatever. And what was really interesting was that the interviewers who really struggled were the young ones who were really good interviewers, but they really struggled because they just didn't have as much life experience to help them cope with listening to really difficult stuff. And we ended up running some support workshops specifically for them. So I think actually having some life wisdom and experience and having some tough experiences in your own life possibly makes it just a little bit easier to listen to really difficult stuff, to know that terrible things happen in people's lives and you may well hear about them and you have to deal with it. I mean, I think the other thing I've learned is the most important person in that room is the person who's telling their story, and you want, if at all possible, not to stop them telling their story. So you don't want your emotions to get in the way of them telling their story. So you have to listen carefully to yourself, and you don't necessarily have to suppress your emotion, but you have to sort of manage it in a way that it won't get in the way of them telling their story. And that can be tricky. Sometimes it means you need a break. I don't think I've ever had to stop an interview because I was really struggling, but I know that sometimes I've paused and said, shall we have a break? And I've gone off to the bathroom and quietly sat by myself for a few minutes and thought, well, crikey, what's going on? And that was difficult, and sort of composed myself. More often, you're dealing with their emotions and so on. But no, I don't think there's a perfect answer, except the most important thing we've learned, particularly from feminist oral historians in the last 20, 30 years, have just reminded us to listen to ourselves as well as at the same time as we're listening to the person who's talking to us. And you have to sort of do that stereo so that your own stuff, your own baggage doesn't get in the way. But it might give you a clue to something. If you're feeling something powerfully as they're talking, but they're not showing that emotion, it probably suggests that something very powerful is happening, and it might make you think either I need to be careful or maybe I should ask a follow-up question. It might be, as you were talking about, I got a sense that was a significant moment for you in your life. Would you like to talk more about it? So, I think listening to yourself while you're listening to them is probably the most important lesson I've learned. I'm sure all of you, particularly if you've been doing interviews around the Holocaust or listening to them, you'll have a sense of how you've dealt with exactly that same issue. Thank you. That's a lovely question. Thank you, Dahlia.
Well, thanks to Al for making this point that we should be listening to ourselves. And also thanks for reminding us another point in oral history. Oral history is one of those few fields which actually works against ageism. It's a place where there's an advantage to age, both with the interviewee sometimes, but also for the interviewer. We forget, and that's remarkable. Sharon had a question afterwards, Efrat. Sharon, please.
Yes, thank you. Thank you for this super interesting talk. I have two short questions. First is about the interview itself. Was it an open conversation with a questionnaire? How did it work? And the second, maybe it related also a bit to what you just about to your answer. What about silence? Both interviewer and interviewee during the interviews. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, Sharon. Good questions. The interview guide, we thought long and hard about this. What we wanted, what the National Library wanted, they wanted Australians of different ages to tell the story of their life in depth and detail across 4 or 5 hours and 2 different sessions. And we didn't have a topic-based guide. We really, in one sense, had a tell me your story and then listened and followed very carefully. But we made a decision that because we wanted to get depth and detail, that if we felt that this person had a very rich story about a particular aspect of their experience, that we would drill down and spend more time with that. So if, for example, theirs was a story where religious faith was very significant, then we said to our interviewers, and I was one of the interviewers, if you think that's the case, don't rush, spend some time, spend an hour talking to them about faith in their life. Follow where it's going. And to guide the interviewers, we produced a number of short single-page bullet point guides on a range of different topics and themes in Australian history, so that if it was about faith or work or technology or parenting, there were some ideas for the interviewers. Most of the interviewers were quite experienced historians, and they knew a lot about 20th century Australian history. So if the person was a man who'd started working with computers in the 1970s and been through all the computer revolution, then most of the interviewers knew enough about that to really follow it up. But I suppose the short answer to your question is, when I did the interviews, I did about a dozen interviews for the project. I had a guide, but really I barely looked at it, and I mostly followed them. But I was making notes to myself all the time about things to come back to or to pick up and follow up. And that varied. Some people are just great storytellers. You don't have to do a lot of work. Some people you have to work harder. But it was unstructured, and as a result, the interviews are variable in quality. Some of them are just wonderful. Some of them I wish there'd been a little bit more structure. It varied. On your second question about silence, it's a good question about how you capture silence. In a transcript, I normally put in brackets pause, and we did that in the book as well, just to indicate there's a pause there. We never know whether you put long pause or short pause or uncomfortable pause or etc. But normally we don't judge what type of pause it is. But what it means is you have to listen to that pause and think and listen to it in the context of what's been said before and what's said afterwards, because almost invariably, if there's a long pause in an interview, it probably means something. It might be that they're just racking their memory to think about what's going on. And you can usually see that because, if you're doing an interview, their eyes move to the top of their head. They're literally searching for memories. And if you're an interviewer, hopefully you just let them keep searching until they find, or they say, I can't remember. But often it's a pause when they're remembering something uncomfortable or shameful, or they're trying to think, how do they tell this story that they've never told? So for me, noting that there is a pause and then never assuming what it means and listening to it or watching it if you've got a video interview to try and think about, well, what's going on. And if you're good enough as an interviewer, if there is a long pause, they will often carry on, and it may be they change topic, and that may be because they just didn't know what to do. And possibly if you feel as comfortable, you might, maybe 10, 15, 20 minutes later, you might come back and said, you were talking about that before and you stopped. Do you want to say more about that? And sometimes it opens up. Sometimes they'll do that without you asking. But, that's a really hard skill to do in an interview, to be listening so carefully, so deeply, to be picking up those clues as they're talking, or indeed when they're not talking, to think about how you then might ask a question that will help someone elaborate and deepen what's going on. And you have to judge, is it a pause because this is too painful to talk about? So there's lots of judging, and you're thinking and working really hard doing an interview. And then there's another type of thinking when you're interpreting an interview and listening or watching that pause and thinking, well, what went on there? What's going on? Really important. Yeah, yes. I think it was Louisa Passerini who reminded us way back in the 1970s to listen for silence. It's such a useful notion. Thank you.
So listening and interpreting silence is indeed one of the biggest challenges. We all know the biggest challenges of oral history. And I think it's appropriate that Ifad bin Zaev put up a hand, because she's written very evocatively about silences in the context of 1948 and what that means and how they're loaded. So Ifad, please.
Thank you very much. So thank you. This was a great lecture. And I want to ask particularly, start from saying that in 1948, people who speak about the war tend not to disclose emotions. So my question to you is particularly about the Anzac veterans, but altogether, would you say that there are certain emotions that intersect with generations, and kind of you zooming out and looking at Australian generations?
That's such a good question, because as you rightly say, emotions change across time and experience, but also the extent to which the people around us articulate emotions vary with generations. There's no doubt that Australian men of my grandfather's generation were more emotionally reticent. They didn't articulate emotions as much as men of my generation, and possibly as much as women of their own generation. And so if you're listening in 1983 to 85-year-old men remembering 1915 and the First World War, there's a lot going on, because they're also actually they've been through those changes, and some of them have actually changed the way they deal with emotion in their lives. By the time they're old men, they're not the same as they were when they were a young man. So they can sometimes name emotions and even speak emotions that they couldn't articulate when they were young. And for us, that's hard to know. Is that because they couldn't articulate it in 1915 because they were young, or because that was an emotion that was impossible to articulate? The best example I can think of was Fred Farrell, who's a man I interviewed for about 10 hours over several years, who was a First World War veteran. And Fred was a young country boy who enlisted as an 18-year-old, had a terrible war. Most of his friends who he enlisted with were killed. He was badly wounded and injured, and basically suffered, complicated story, but from shell shock or neurosis. Came back from the war, had a speech impediment, could hardly talk, could not talk about his war experience. And he literally couldn't talk about his war for 50 years until the 1970s, during the Vietnam War, when suddenly the soldier as victim became an Australian story because of the Vietnam War. It became, people asked and were interested in the difficult emotions of battle. And Fred suddenly had people who wanted to hear those stories that he'd never been able to talk. And he also had seen a psychiatrist in the 1940s who'd helped him deal with the neurosis. And by the time I interviewed Fred in 1983, this man who couldn't talk about his war for 50 years now couldn't stop talking about it. And he talked about it. It's really interesting. He, partly to deal with the speech impediment and the neurosis, he'd learned to speak very carefully and slowly. So it almost sounds monotone when he's speaking, but he describes the emotion of terror. He describes the emotion of grief. He describes how every home he ever lived in Australia after the war, he named after one of the friends who died in the war. So the emotion in that interview was so powerful. It was emotion from the 1910s, but it was articulated by a man who changed the way he understood his life and who had different ways to articulate emotions in 1983. And he was talking to a young man of a different generation, and probably that was shaping what he did and didn't say as well. It's such an interesting question, and shows you how complex it is. Remembering the past when you're remembering it from a very different place, not just socially, but also you're remembering it from a very different place in your life.
Now, I'm keenly aware that it's past midnight for Al Thompson.
Oh, that's okay. I'm fine. I'm wide awake, guy. It's okay.
All right. So in that case, actually, I might probe you a little bit further, because Efrat is touching on exactly the issues which I've been thinking out throughout your talk. This notion of emotional generations. I mean, you gave us this rich picture of different temporal frameworks. You talked at least about 3-4 different times originally, the time of the event, the time of the telling, the time of the listening is 3 times. And on the other hand, we have generations, which we often think as horizontal categories, right? There's horizontal categories. And I know that one of the challenges of the whole project when it originally began, when the National Library supported this project, was, are we going to rethink what generations means in Australia? You know, there's this kind of notion of the founder generation, the baby boom, as it goes through the Generation X, Generation Y, the Gen Zs, we have this notion of generations. But the idea was that by talking with lots of people, we're going to challenge that, right? Or you're going to challenge that. And I'm thinking about this because there are certain emotions which are attached to certain generations horizontally. And there's also things that travel vertically, but there's also emotions change, as you say, over time, right? And not only that, our attitude to emotions changes over time. You gave the example here of the language of trauma in your own work on Anzac, how that changed everything. The moment the language of trauma and PTSD came into the picture, it gave a new vocabulary to deal with emotions that you couldn't talk about before. So people change in their lifetime. And I'm thinking particularly now, one of the issues we've become attuned to, it's around the world, that it's around the words that the younger ones use for boomers, when they say the boomers, right? The notion that certain the language has changed how we deal with things. People feel out of sync when they deal with issues in the past. It's particularly strong when it comes to issues of racism, very loaded issues. So things that you might have said in the past with the language you might have used in the past are inappropriate now. And that changes the way of how you approach it and the awkwardness of approaching it. And there's glaring examples. I mean, you listen to give somebody who's been disgraced, you listen to Rolf Harris, who used to be extremely popular in Australia in the past, and you listen to some of the tunes that have been taken out of songs that he used to sing in the past, because you just can't say that anymore now. But you know that in the 60s, everybody was rocking to them, right? I mean, it was kind of swinging around with this kind of music. Yeah. It makes you think. So if you'd like to comment on this kind of notion of generations of emotions and how they change vertically and horizontally.
It's interesting. I have a terrible admission to make. When we knew we wanted to interview Australians born across time, so people born in the 1920s right up until people born in 1989, which when we did the interviews was the age of 18. We didn't want to, it was too difficult to interview young people. So our interviews were aged from 18 right through to the mid-90s. So and the National Library wanted to get the experiences of different generations, different groups of people. The phrase Australian generations, when we were putting in the funding bid, we just thought, what's a catchy phrase that we can use for the funding bid that might get us the funding? So that's what we did, and then we wrapped it up with all sorts of sociological speak about generations and so on. I have to admit, I became very suspicious of notions of generations. I realised that actually a lot of those ideas like baby boomers, Gen X, dreamed up by marketing people who are trying to work out how do we sell products effectively to different age groups. So I'm a little bit suspicious, but at the same time, clearly people who've lived through the same times, that's significant. And what becomes really clear is if you've lived through a time at the time of your youth, which is very impressionable, the experiences in your youthful years are really profoundly significant in shaping identity for a range of reasons. So, people who came of age in the late 60s and early 1970s, they were living through a tumultuous time, and their coming to adulthood was also a time of radical transformation. And so they remember, were defined by Australian society at the time as the 60s generation. In fact, it was really the 70s. But they also often thought of themselves as defined in those terms. But not all age clusters or whatever get generationally defined. People who grew up in the 50s and 60s, there's not the same sort of significant moments, and so they don't have such a strong generational identity. So the people who grew up through the Depression of the 1930s profoundly shaped generationally. People who grew up and came of age in the late 60s and 70s, that's also profound. Not true necessarily for other age groups, but clearly, and this with music, I mean, when you interview people and they remember the music that they grew up with, and that's very powerful, and they share that with people of a similar age, but it doesn't necessarily make that generationally significant. But I think, was it Everett's question before about thinking about, for a particular age cohort, what were the life experiences that have shaped them, but also what were the ways in which they were able to articulate and make sense of their experience in their life, but also how's it changed across time? I mean, if you learn anything from oral history interviews, is that people adapt and change and learn new ways of understanding their lives and their society, which is why it's so exciting when you interview an 80-year-old who's actually really modern and really transgressive and challenges all your expectations about what an 80-year-old should be.
Well, thank you very much for that. I think, with your permission, unless if there's somebody has a burning question, I'm highly aware of the time differences here, and I think we got a lot out of this talk. Definitely, I got a lot. It's taken me to whole new directions of looking at history. And I think maybe the most appropriate way would be if we'd all unmute ourselves and actually clap audibly, so we can actually hear clapping, not just the signs of clapping. So I'll invite everybody to unmute themselves for a minute, and we can thank Al appropriately.
That's lovely. There's a lovely Australian novel called The Sound of One Hand Clapping, which is all about a migrant woman's experience in a refugee camp in the 1950s. And yeah, you just reminded me, and the sound of clapping is something that we've missed.
Absolutely. Thank you very much, Al. Thank you for everybody for attending.
Yes, thank you all.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Lovely.
Good night and good morning.
Yes. Thank you, Guy. Thanks very much for chairing. And thank you, Sharon and Margaret, for organising this event. It was a real pleasure. And hopefully one day I can do it in person.